Thank you, and it's great to see you all here today. So thanks for those kind words as well, Tony. So I'm really pleased to be sharing with you today our learnings from Vicarious Trauma in terms of both our research that we've done in this space, as well as, I guess, the practical experiences and implementations that we've worked with you on. So going to talk a little bit about today what is vicarious trauma, what does that mean, and then share with you the model and how it works in practice, as Tony said, from a prevention and intervention space. There'll be opportunities for questions at the end of the speech, so if you would like to ask any questions, Tony will open up the floor right at the end. So in terms of what is vicarious trauma, and as Tony mentioned, vicarious trauma is relatively new as a topic. The way it came about, just from a technical point of view, was in 2013, the DSM, which is the diagnosis manual that psychiatrists and psychologists use to be able to understand what's going on in terms of a clinical condition, acknowledged vicarious trauma as a diagnosable condition. So it used to be that trauma was only acknowledged when someone was directly experiencing it themselves, but now this has actually been broadened, and vicarious trauma is about exposure to stories, so hearing it from someone else. It can be from watching a situation occur, and it can be through debriefing with someone as well, or reading some documentation around vicarious trauma. So we can see that the flow-on impact can actually be much more broad-ranging than for first responders. So we know that the clearest predictor of vicarious trauma is exposure. So if you're hearing it, if you're seeing it, if you're reading about it, that's a predictor of experiencing vicarious trauma. The effects can be short-term in nature and very normal, that people can react from reading something that's terrible, seeing something on TV that's terrible, hearing about something that's terrible. Or it can be more long-term and cumulative in nature. And this is one of the things we need to look out for, the more long-term cumulative nature, if we don't put supports and controls in place to mitigate those long-term risks. One of the key factors in vicarious trauma in terms of the development is empathy. So we're not telling people to stop being empathic in their roles, absolutely not. We're talking about how we can actually support people in their roles to be better at recovering from hearing, seeing or reading about traumatic information, and also about what we can do as a framework, as an organisational framework. And as Tony mentioned, Megan will talk about what they've done with their high-risk roles. In terms of the stats, we know that law firms are impacted these days in terms of vicarious trauma. Social workers, so those in the helping professions, social workers, psychologists, counsellors, and journalists, as Megan will elaborate on shortly, in terms of being exposed to eyewitness material. How we see it play out in the professions, we've seen it with lawyers working on institutionalised abuse cases with the Catholic Church. We've seen it with lawyers working pro bono matters, supporting asylum seeker applications. We've seen it with lawyers first of all, family lawyers who are dealing with difficult custodial and family and domestic violence situations. And we've seen it with lawyers in litigation matters where there's complex traumatic litigation going on. We see it with social workers, where social workers and psychologists are debriefing with those who are experiencing those traumatic information. So they're hearing, they're providing that counselling and supporting those people that are actually dealing with that traumatic information. We see it from journalists. So journalists and photographers is a high-risk area. One of the key things that we've seen recently is that in The Age, there was a landmark decision handed down in Victoria in a local court, I think it was, the first of its kind, where a journalist successfully sued The Age newspaper for failing to act on a duty of care in terms of health and safety, and experienced trauma as a result. She was a court reporter, she was first on scene responder and reporter, and she had said to her workplace, I can't keep on doing this, but they kept on sending her back into the field, sending her back onto those first responder matters, sending her to court matters, which kept on re-triggering her. And this is the first case of its kind where a journalist has been awarded compensation because of a workplace failing to uphold a duty of care. We see it with first responders, obviously. So ambulance officers, police officers and fireys, obviously they see the direct trauma. But in terms of another case, which is interesting and come out in the media at the moment, is Siege Cafe of a few years ago, obviously. A sniper is actually suing New South Wales Police, I believe, for failing to provide a duty of care because they believe that the head of the siege control was receiving inappropriate advice, and the sniper felt that they could have lives didn't need to be lost if they had taken alternative action, and that the sniper is claiming vicarious trauma as a result. So that's just going through the courts now. So we'll wait to see how that unfolds. And we also see in customer services, so those in contact centres, we see customers abusing people on contact centres, threatening lives of themselves or others, and so the contact centre employees are now having to deal with high-risk calls or abusive calls, threatening calls on an almost daily basis, and that can be traumatic in nature as well.